Okay, so first question off the top, just a little popcorn, however you want to answer it. But what was like, as appropriately as you want to share, what was your first like encounter with like the topic or the idea of like sex or pornography or like the opposite gender's bodies? Like, what was it for you? Like, what was that scenario for you like? I know for me, like, it's so weird. There was this, in elementary school, there was a foreign exchange student from France, and he spent the night at my house, and he was over on my home computer, you know, when we had dial-up internet and we had home computers, and my parents were asleep and we were playing video games. I look over and he just like downloads stuff off like my Napster account or whatever it was, a LimeWire account, and it's just straight up porn, and I'd never seen this before.
I had a similar experience with a friend like down the street from my grandmother. She was like, "We can pay-per-view," and I said, what is that? I had no idea.
Pay-per-view?
I know, this was on the big screen.
Wow.
Also 10 years old, I was like, what the heck is happening to me? I had no clue. And then it also kind of messed me up. I was like, I don't know what is happening.
Yeah.
And I didn't have like the space to ask questions either. I just went, is this supposed to be a good thing? Like, I was so outside the realm of like understanding.
Yeah, the first time I was really introduced to the idea of like what sex really is, I was a 7th grader going in 8th grade over the summer. I went to a summer camp for tennis, and I got there was 4 beds, and I got paired with three guys who were going to be freshmen in high school. So I was much younger than them, and it was so casual for them to talk about it, and I had never heard about it. And they were like, yeah, like just I'll pull it up on my phone and show you. And just a whole new world.
Yeah, for me, this question is a little harder to answer just because back in the day. No, my parents.
5 years older than
I
Calm down.
I don't see that. Like we just didn't talk about it. Like at all, like in my family. So I'm trying to even remember, I'm like, when was the first time that I saw or heard? And I'm just thinking about just from my friends, you know, just they would talk about it and they didn't even know what they were talking about. But like just, you know, their imagination or what they thought it was, you know. And so I think I had this big idea or image of what it was from all different sources. So from friends, from church, from really no adults.
You know, 2 years ago now, we will have had our last conversation with Mountain students about sex and sexuality. If you're tuning in, now you know we're talking about sex. Welcome to the Sex Talk Around the Table. We are your lovely, amazing students, pastors from most of our campuses, and we are trying to almost in some ways take some attempts to just destigmatize and even acknowledge that so much of our experiences as adults and leaders in the room, you probably are thinking some similar ways that you heard about sex growing up, but just when sex is taboo or when something's taboo, it makes it really difficult to discuss. And when it's something as important and vital as this conversation, like sex, like what this is, it can be traumatic, it can be confusing, it can be irresponsible, if I'm being honest. And so for us at Mountain Students, what we want to do is just simply say, like, let's talk about sex. And we're going to get some of the awkward stuff out of the way first. So each of us are coming into this conversation from just completely different places. Even where we are right now, you know, most of us are married around the table, and that's a different experience. You know, you being single, Olivia, that's a different experience. You know, you got married a year ago. That's a different experience. You've been married for 17 years, 18 years. So like all of us are coming in this space just different. And so this first conversation that I want to hold, I kind of want to just say this is a conversation about broken sex, and just let that be our umbrella of conversation for a few minutes, because I don't think it's subjective. I don't think it's my opinion to think that sex today just appears broken. I think everyone is to blame, including all of us around this table, as to why sex is broken. So someone start a conversation like, well, how is sex broken? What's going on? What are some reasons you can think of?
I think first off, the culture kind of views sex as something meaningless. And at the same time, I think we also really want to have meaningful and meaning coming from having sex. And so it's something where one culture is saying one thing, but then our inner desires really are craving and longing for something else. And so it's kind of weird because we, in some ways, say sex is nothing, but at the same time, we want so much more from sex than I think sex can even provide us.
I think there's something to be said just like about how as you get further and further away from like your parents' generation, it feels like sex has become less and less something that is saved for a piece of, I don't know, growth almost. And I think there is some space to be said like, well, yeah, that's why I sleep around. To get to know somebody, you got to test drive a car before you buy it. That sort of thing feels kind of funny to me, but also that is a lot of what culture says. It's just like, it's not that important. And like Sean is saying, like we want it to mean so much. And I think because we want it to mean so much, we throw it away even more.
There's this great line that I read that we burden sex with more than it can bear. And I think that's so true with what you're saying. We're asking it to carry something that it just simply can't give it.
And then at the same time, though, the opposite's also true, that it can be held in such a high esteem, like you're saying, which I think this is probably where some of the organized church is to blame, where it's just like, you know, you save yourself for sex, for marriage, because when you get to do that, then you get the privilege of having the best sex of your life. And like, that's not what it is.
I think for me too, when I think back, it's, for me, it's like I needed a sense of belonging. And I thought that is what I needed to fill that. And I needed to be loved. And so I think a lot of times we look at sex as that's love. And it's so much more.
And to put some language around it, too often we either see one of these two types of sexuality and that's our only definition instead of seeing it as a broader thing. There's what's called social sexuality, and that's just a longing to feel connected to people, to in some ways be intimate, not sexually even, just emotionally intimate, to be wanted, desired, loved. At the same time, the other one, and you're gonna laugh at this, but it's genital sexuality. And as much as that is the act of having sex, it's also more than just grinding body on body. Like it is something to where
I hated that so much.
It's also this thing where we have this ability to, in a very self-sacrificial way, give our lives to someone and something else too.
Man, and how often is sex seen as just like a part of the dating process? You know, like if I'm going to date someone, if I'm like 13, 14, if I'm 21, 20, it doesn't matter. Like if I'm going to date someone, like, you know, was it date 3? Like by date 3, we're hooking up, or we're on Tinder or something, and we're, you know, getting that first whatever, that first night, just one night stand. And like that's just part of the dating process.
I think it's just part of us normalizing it and thinking, and sex is normal. That's not but it's, I guess, taking away like also the importance of it, of just making it, this is what you do kind of thing. This is part of everyday life.
Well, there's another way too. Like I think that culture is saying no, like that's the only way to approach it is by the third date. If you're not doing something in the sphere of sexuality, then you've not been dating correctly. And I think it comes that there's actually been faulty views in the church and faulty views in culture. And to be honest, I think it's really hard to find the right view. There is this book called Fill These Hearts by Christopher West, and he lays out these 3 different diets of sexual formation. And it's this idea of the first one being much more of a starvation diet. And this is typically what we've seen in the church. And it's all about repressing your sexual desires. It's about resisting those types of things. And that's in some ways viewed in the church as like that's the way you're supposed to do it, but I actually don't see that throughout the Bible. That's what you're supposed to do. Now, yes, you might have some sort of repressing in some circumstances, but not all the time. At the same time, the second diet is this fast food diet, and it's much more of like sex is casual, it doesn't matter, and it's really a reduction in the view of sexuality, and just really kind of reduces it to this commonplace and it doesn't matter. The third view is the banquet view, and this is actually the idea that humanity was made for community and intimacy together. And this is the view that I see the Bible portray. And you go all the way back to Genesis, like it's meant to be this really good, holy thing. And far too often we either reduce it or we repress it. And that's not what God wants for our lives when it comes to the area of sexuality.
So you're saying that we should just be able to have sex with people?
No, I'm not saying that you can just have sex.
Well, I think that we need to discuss that a little further, though, because it low-key sounds like, well, so yeah, if that's the case, Sean, then like I think that then I should not repress my
And
sexual desire.
here's where this book redefines sex, and this is going to be something that might be mind-blowing for some of us, but being a sexual being, being a human being, doesn't mean that we need to practice physical sex. But it does mean we need to be able to have people that we can be emotionally intimate with and be connected with. And you don't have to have the physical act of sex. I think this is where Deborah Hirsch has this great definition of what sexuality is. And it says it's a longing to be known and be known by other people. Yeah. To know and be known by other people. And that's the idea of sexuality. Ironically, spirituality is the same thing, only instead of it being by other people, it's with God. And so this means like our emotional, our psychological, our spiritual levels. And so what we find is sexuality and spirituality are linked together. Like it's not something we can just separate. One is about being connected and being able to know and be known by people, and the other one's to know and be known by God. And I think that's just so powerful in this conversation to realize that we all are human beings. We all have a sexual part of our life. We all have a spiritual part of our life. And those are not things that we can just put in a box and put off to the side. Like they're connected, they're whole together.
Back to the top of this of like how sex is broken. We're talking about intimacy. So like even as like, the single representative at the table, it's that moment of like that part of just understanding yourself is so broken of like, I guess there's still something that innately wants that human connection, even if it's not physically. It's like there are so many parts of you that are connected to just the people around you. And I think that is part of what makes being human so amazing is like, you get to connect with people and you have this strong desire to be known, like Sean is saying.
Yeah, I think you had a really valuable perspective because you can probably speak to this. You're the only one that can speak to this at this table, but like, society tells you if you're single, you need to find a partner or a boyfriend, whatever. Yeah. But you're saying like, and they're saying, society's saying that because you need to feel intimate relationships with other people. But you're saying, I don't necessarily need to be in a relationship with a certain someone for that to happen. Yeah. I can find that in other areas.
I think it's really important when we ask this question to think about how did Jesus talk about this, or what did Jesus do when it came to the idea of sexuality, or what did he teach? And I think it's really interesting. Jesus doesn't actually go on teaching this new thing. He actually goes back to the very beginning. He actually goes back and quotes the beginning of Genesis and talks about how in verses 26 and 27 in Genesis 1, it says, God said, let us make mankind in our own image and our own likeness so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. He talks about how we were made in the image of God. And that continues on in Genesis 2, verses 24 and 25. And that is why a man leaves his father and mother, is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. And I think it's really interesting that Jesus goes back all the way there to talk about that is what sexuality is supposed to look like. They were both naked, and there was no shame.
Okay, as a student, I'm listening, and it's all great stuff, but I'm thinking, what if I have sex and I don't feel the shame?
Give it a minute.
Because I'm just saying, I've had so many students come in and sit in front of me and say, yeah, like I had sex, and I don't see what the big deal is.
Well, and at the same time, they don't feel any shame. But they don't have language to describe it. But I think if you probe and go a little bit deeper, they probably want something more than what they got from that encounter.
Definitely.
And that's where, like, as a middle schooler or high schooler trying to figure out these adult level things, you don't have language for it. You might not feel shame.
Right.
But I would be surprised if someone said, yeah, I got everything I wanted from that.
Olivia, you had a passing like criticism of that, like kind of under your breath, like, don't worry, give it a minute. But like seriously, what they're saying is right. Like if you give it 10 more years and all of a sudden like that's just the life you're doing and like you're going out and you're trying to meet people, you're hooking up, like you're going to feel that.
Well, and I think I remember saying this phrase in college. It was like, I think I probably just have a different sexual ethic than you. Just like because of the people that are around me. And like I went to a Christian university. I think the four of us here would know that that is not a place where everybody is Christian. So like there's still a lot of things happening on that campus that you wouldn't imagine. But like I do think that that is a piece of like, even to that point where I went, oh, yep, okay. And I feel differently about that than you do. But I think I have a perspective that feels biblical and Christ-centered, and I cannot tell you that you aren't having fun, because Lord knows I don't know, but like you might one day go, I wish I didn't have that experience.
I dated someone in high school for about 2 years, and we were sexual together, and at the time it just felt like this like there was an emotional there's always going to be an emotional attachment with any intimacy between you and another person, but it almost felt like, you know, in hindsight looking back, it was like we did all these things to to do them, not necessarily because we really loved each other or felt like it was the right thing. Like I think we both knew, like, yeah, we shouldn't do these things. But
can I ask you a personal question? So that happened in high school. How has that affected your relationships after that, through college or through different times, and how does that affect your marriage now?
Yeah, I was looking back after we broke up. Looking back, just realized, you know, carried a lot of shame and guilt from it, but just always had my guard very much up. Learning from that experience, just, you know, going into relationships with the end in mind. You know, the next person I dated is my wife after that. So always just being upfront with her, you know, obviously letting her know what had happened, but then just being clear about what I wanted and what I desired, and hey, I want to wait. You know, I'm not interested in having sex before we get married.
We mentioned what Jesus went back to. Just even mentioning, going along with the conversation we're having, Jesus actually takes that teaching one step further. And you can find that in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. But when it comes to talking about you shall not commit adultery, which is one of the 10 Commandments, it's one of those things that's designed as a guardrail so that you don't feel shame when it comes to the sexual area of your life. He takes it up like one step further and says, but I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her heart. And he says, if your right eye has caused you to sin, gouge it out. Like, don't even mess with this type of thing. And I think it's really interesting that Jesus is talking about, like, hey, this is one of those things that is not just something that affects you, it affects your body, it affects other relationships, and it's something that you just can't treat casually, because as we're seeing around this table, like, it has deep implications going forward.
Yeah. I feel like even in a secular world, there are people who get to their like late mid 30s and they're like, they have no other reason other than like they just are like, sex is not the only thing that I don't want that anymore. So like there are people who are dating who are my age and older who are like and were sexually active and say, I think I want that to be the last. Like, I don't want to do that now. That has been what I have done in the past. And for whatever reason, they're also similarly convicted of like, I don't think that's what I want to do anymore. And I think that is also a partial answer to your question of like, eventually, that's my like, give it a minute. Eventually, I think all of us kind of catch up and go, even if it's not because we feel like we have the biblical perspective, it's also, we just crave a lot of intimacy, and I think we see, even as we get older, like, oh no, that was not the answer.
Well, and it doesn't
like
even have to be between two people.
No.
Like, my wife's the only person that I've had sexual intercourse with, but and this has taken a lot of counseling, a lot of different things to work through, but the joke around our staff team sometimes is I'm a robot. Part of the reason why I come across as a robot is because I struggle with emotional intimacy, because my whole view of emotional intimacy and just intimacy in general has been screwed up through masturbation, pornography, and struggling through that through middle school and high school, not having any language or capacity to share. Even in college, going to a Bible college, studying to be a pastor, it was still something that I've regularly struggled with. And let me tell you, that conversation with my wife, sharing that with her while we were dating or engaged, I can't remember the exact time, like that was an extremely difficult conversation to have. And I'm lucky that Asha met that with so much grace, was able to see that I was broken and wanted to change. And luckily it's something that I've been able to change in my own life, but I still struggle today with emotional intimacy with that.
I remember I had to tell Shad about how I had been sexually active, and he had saved himself. And just even in that moment of like, oh, like he saved himself for me, like, and waited, and I did not. And that was a little rough. Like he was very graceful about it, but for me, like the feeling of, oh, I can't say that, I can't do that.
Well, let's close there and leave time for our students to have some conversation. So head into your groups, and we'll talk more about sexual intimacies and sexual integrity in our next conversation. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.